Welcome to this explainer. Look, if you're sitting in the C-suite, you already spend a ton of time sweating over external threats, right? You're tracking market volatility, aggressive competitors, those crazy disruptive technologies. But today, we're actually going to look inward. We're going to completely reframe how we think about cognitive biases. We really need to stop treating them as just quirky personality traits or fun psychological trivia. Instead, I want you to start viewing them as invisible insider threats. These are hidden flaws in our mental architecture that systematically compromise our strategic vision and literally sabotage multi-million-dollar bets. So here is our briefing agenda for today. We'll start with the invisible executive threat of trusting the gut. Then we'll break down the machinery of intuition, look at the strategic damage caused by delusional optimism, explore exactly how these biases poison corporate culture, and finally, we'll talk about how to actually engineer a smarter organization. All right, let's dive into section 1. The invisible executive threat, trusting the gut. We have to kick things off by asking a pretty uncomfortable question. Why is it that executives, people with massive intellects and basically endless resources at their disposal, routinely make totally irrational, multi-million-dollar bets based entirely on a gut feeling? Well, the Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman actually visited the chief investment officer of a massive financial firm to find out. This executive had literally just invested tens of millions of dollars in Ford Motor Company stock. And when Kahneman asked him how he made that enormous decision, his answer was, honestly, it was shocking. He said he'd recently gone to a car show, he really liked the cars, and he was just super impressed. He literally said, boy, do they know how to make a car. That was it. He trusted his gut, he felt great about it, and he pulled the trigger on a massive financial investment. This story is just a brilliant illustration of a concept called heuristic substitution. See, the target question, the one any rational economist would tell you is the only relevant question here, was, is Ford's stock currently underpriced? But let's be real, that is a highly complex, incredibly difficult question to answer. So what did this executive's brain do instead? It just automatically substituted it with an easier, highly emotional, heuristic question. Do I like Ford cars? He answered that easy question, and then he used that answer to make a multi-million-dollar decision, completely unaware that his brain had totally swapped the questions on him. Which brings us to section 2, the machinery of intuition, the two employees. To understand how we fall for mental traps like heuristic substitution, we kind of need to meet the culprits. I want you to imagine that you have two completely different employees running the boardroom of your mind. Kahneman calls them System 1 and System 2. System 1 is your fast, automatic, emotional, and frankly, highly gullible idea generator. It operates in a fraction of a second, mostly just matching intensities and jumping to conclusions. And then you have System 2. Now, System 2 is logical, it's analytical, it can do complex computations. But System 2 has a fatal flaw. It is incredibly lazy. It acts way more like a rubber stamp compliance officer. So most of the time, instead of doing the hard work to actually verify an idea, System 2 just lazily endorses whatever impulse System 1 throws at it. You can think of System 1 as operating a bit like a mental shotgun. It just constantly fires off these loose associations and basic assessments. Now, jumping to conclusions is fine. It's actually really efficient if you're an expert in a totally familiar environment. Think of a chess master instantly reading a board. But it becomes a massive, dangerous liability when the situation is unfamiliar, you have zero time to collect more information, and the stakes are in the millions. Moving on to section 3, delusional optimism and the strategic damage. So how do these invisible mental mechanics actually go about destroying corporate strategy and financial forecasting? Well, consider this glaring statistic. In a study where chief financial officers were asked to predict the returns of the S&P 500, researchers found that these top executives were overwhelmingly prone to overconfidence. In fact, to avoid the massive rate of surprises they actually ended up experiencing, the confidence intervals those CFOs used should have been more than 4 times wider than what they stated. I mean, let that sink in for a second. The exact people in charge of the numbers were incredibly overconfident in their own ability to forecast the future, completely underestimating the vastness of their own ignorance. This brand of overconfidence feeds directly into what we call the planning fallacy. It's driven by System 1's YSI-AI rule, which stands for what you see is all there is. Executives fall into this trap of delusional optimism. You start hyper-focusing on your own brilliant plans and completely ignore both the competition and the actual base rate statistics of failure. This is exactly what fuels the hubris hypothesis in mergers and acquisitions. Executives make these delusional bets, acquiring companies because they genuinely, and usually mistakenly, believe they can just manage the assets way better than the current owners. And the results? They end up destroying shareholder value.
And right here is where we see prospect theory and the sunk cost fallacy really take hold. Imagine a project is failing. Say you're already $50 million in the hole. You face a choice. Do you accept a sure loss, or do you take a highly unfavorable gamble to try and save face? Well, because humans are naturally loss-averse, meaning the psychological pain of losing is significantly stronger than the joy of winning, executives will almost always choose the gamble. They just throw good money after bad. Kahneman compares this to paying for a ticket and then driving straight into a deadly blizzard just because, well, you already spent the money. You have to ask yourself, does your organization trap itself by continually driving into the blizzard?
Let's look at section 4 now, how biases poison culture. The cultural damage. We need to shift our focus for a minute from financial strategy to corporate culture. Because these invisible biases, they do a lot more than just wreck balance sheets. They create highly toxic work environments. Have you ever noticed how totally predictable everything looks after it happens? Yeah, that's hindsight bias. And closely related to that is outcome bias. Our sense-making minds dangerously rewrite history. We end up judging the quality of a leader's decision solely by the outcome, completely ignoring whether the actual decision-making process itself was fundamentally flawed or sound at the time.
If outcome bias takes root in your company, these are the symptoms your culture is going to suffer from. You'll start seeing boards rewarding reckless executives who took completely crazy gambles and just happened to get lucky. And conversely, you'll see them actively punishing sensible leaders who made great, highly calculated decisions that simply ran into unpredictable bad luck. You really have to ask yourself honestly, does your company actually reward skill and good process, or are you just evaluating leaders entirely in hindsight and rewarding blind luck?
And of course, we can't talk about culture without mentioning the halo effect. Look, our minds desperately want a tidy, coherent story, so we create this illusion of understanding. If a company is doing great, the CEO is described as methodical and focused. But if that exact same company starts failing, suddenly that very same CEO doing the exact same behaviors is described as rigid and stubborn. The halo effect totally warps our performance evaluations and tricks us into thinking we understand the roots of success and failure, when in reality, we really don't.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5. Engineering a smarter organization, quality control.
So, the big question, how do we actually fix this? Well, here is the blunt truth. You cannot easily rewire an individual executive's System 1. Your brain is just going to keep generating biases. That's what it does. But you absolutely can rewire your organization's procedures to catch those biases. One of the absolute most brilliant procedural fixes for this is Gary Klein's concept of the pre-mortem. It is the ultimate quality control tool to neutralize the planning fallacy and that delusional optimism we talked about earlier. Here's the trick. Instead of asking what could go wrong, you assume the absolute worst has already happened. I highly recommend you deploy this exact sequence in your very next strategy meeting. It's so simple. Step 1, gather your team right before a major decision is formally locked in. Step 2, tell everyone to imagine it's exactly 1 year into the future. Step 3, announce that the plan you all just made was an unmitigated disaster. And Step 4, have everyone independently write a brief history of exactly how and why that disaster happened. This one simple exercise shatters the echo chamber, it completely legitimizes doubt, and it forces that lazy System 2 to finally wake up and do its job. Furthermore, you really need to implement broad risk policies and consistently seek out the outside view. See, evaluating every single project in complete isolation triggers narrow framing and massive loss aversion. But a broad risk policy evaluates bets as a portfolio. It forces executives to step back and look at the statistical base rates of similar projects outside the company. Putting this structural procedure in place protects your company from both paralyzing fear on one end and reckless, overly optimistic gambles on the other.
I want you to consider this incredibly powerful quote from Kahneman. Whatever else it produces, an organization is a factory that manufactures judgments and decisions. Think about it. If you are running a physical manufacturing plant, you have rigorous, strict quality control at every single stage of the assembly line. The C-suite must start treating decision-making with that exact same level of rigor. You need checklists, you need reference class forecasting, and you absolutely need structured reviews.
Which leads perfectly to our final question for you today. Take a hard look at your own internal architecture. Is your organization a meticulously designed factory that consistently produces smart, calibrated decisions? Or is it really just an echo chamber where everyone nods along to the emotional whims and heuristic substitutions of System 1? The choice is entirely yours, but the multi-million-dollar stakes are very, very real. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer. Go start rewiring those procedures, and I'll catch you next time.